Imagine being locked away in a cold stone tower. Not because you committed a crime, not because you were dangerous, but because knowing the truth about you was inconvenient for the most powerful people in the world. Imagine having your name slowly erased from history. Your letters burned, your children taken, your very mind declared broken so that no one would ever have to listen to you again. Now imagine that centuries later, historians would begin to wonder, what if she wasn't mad at all? What if she was simply a woman who knew too much, loved too fiercely, and refused to disappear quietly? Her name was Juana of Castile. And the story the world was told about her, the story of a queen so consumed by grief and madness that she had to be removed from power, is one of the most carefully constructed lies in the history of European monarchy. For nearly 5 centuries, she has been remembered as Juana la Loca. Juana the Mad, a cautionary tale. A tragedy, a woman who lost her mind over a faithless husband and spent 50 years locked in a castle, raving and weeping in the dark. But the deeper you dig into the actual historical record, the more that carefully constructed image begins to crumble. Because the truth about Juana of Castile is far more complicated and far more chilling than anyone was ever supposed to know. To understand what happened to Juana, you first have to understand the world she was born into. The year was 1479. Spain was not yet the unified empire it would become. It was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each with its own laws, its own loyalties, and its own royal bloodlines. Juana was born the 3rd child of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, 2 of the most formidable rulers Europe had ever seen. Together, they had forged a new Spain through a combination of military conquest, political marriage, and an iron-fisted religious uniformity known as the Inquisition. This was the world Juana entered, a world where power was everything, where alliances were sealed in the blood of dynasties, and where women, even royal women, were ultimately possessions to be deployed strategically on the great chessboard of European politics. As a child, Juana was described by those around her as exceptionally intelligent. She was fluent in Latin and spoke several languages. She was deeply curious, keenly perceptive, and possessed of a sharp analytical mind that made her tutors marvel. She was also, by all accounts, deeply emotional, not in the fragile, unstable sense that her enemies would later weaponize against her, but in the way of someone who felt the weight of the world profoundly and could not easily pretend otherwise. In a court where appearances were everything and feelings were strategic tools to be managed, Juana's emotional transparency was already being quietly cataloged as a potential liability. In 1496, when Juana was 17 years old, she was shipped off to the Netherlands to marry Philip of Habsburg, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. The marriage was a political arrangement. Spain needed Habsburg support, and the Habsburgs needed Spanish gold. No one particularly asked Juana what she wanted, but something unexpected happened when Juana and Philip finally met. She fell in love with him. Completely, wholly, devastatingly in love. And for a brief, luminous moment, it seemed Philip might feel the same way. Philip was extraordinarily handsome, so much so that history remembers him as Philip the Handsome, which tells you something about what his contemporaries thought was his most notable quality. He was charming, charismatic, and entirely self-interested. Juana, blinded by genuine feeling, could not yet see what those around her were already beginning to notice: that Philip's affections were as changeable as the weather, that he kept mistresses openly and without apology, and that his interest in Juana was always more political than personal. But Juana loved him with everything she had, and when he withdrew that love, when he spent nights with other women, when he mocked her passionate nature to his courtiers, when he made her feel small and desperate and alone, something broke open inside her that she could never quite close again. Here is where the story becomes genuinely heartbreaking, because what historians have found in the archives is not the portrait of a woman losing her mind. It is the portrait of a woman in psychological anguish, a woman whose husband was systematically humiliating her, whose every expression of pain was being recorded and reframed as evidence of instability. Juana wept. Juana raged. Juana refused to eat. Juana, on more than one occasion, physically confronted the women Philip slept with, once reportedly attacking a lady of the court whose hair Philip had been admiring. These incidents were dutifully reported back to her parents in Spain, and the language used to describe them, hysterical, uncontrollable, unsuitable for queenship, began to stick. Then, in 1500, everything changed in an instant. Juana's older brother, Juan, had died young. Her elder sister Isabella had died in childbirth. Her sister's infant son, who would have been the heir, died shortly after. Suddenly, Juana was no longer a spare. She was the heir to the throne of Castile. The woman her own mother had described in correspondence as difficult and erratic was now the future Queen of Spain. And the political landscape around her shifted dramatically because power always attracts those who wish to control it. Queen Isabella grew increasingly concerned, not, as some historians have suggested, about Juana's mental fitness, but about the specific and dangerous way Philip was behaving. Philip was spending more and more time in the Netherlands, surrounding himself with Flemish advisors, positioning himself to absorb as much power from Spain as possible. He was keeping Juana essentially as a prisoner in her own household, controlling who she could speak to, who could carry messages on her behalf, what information reached her. And when Isabella sent envoys to check on her daughter, Philip either refused them access or was present for every conversation, monitoring every word. Juana, for her part, kept writing desperate letters to her mother asking for help. Letters that Philip intercepted. Isabella died in November of 1504. And at the moment of her death, the trap that had been closing around Juana snapped shut. Because now Philip, her charming, faithless, politically ambitious husband, stood to rule Castile in her name. And there was someone else watching very carefully. Someone who had everything to gain from Juana being declared incapable of ruling. Her own father, Ferdinand of Aragon. What followed was one of the most cynical power struggles in European history. Philip and Ferdinand both wanted control of Castile. Juana was queen, but if she could be painted as mentally unfit, then whichever man could position himself as her protector and regent would hold the real power. Philip moved first. He brought Juana to Spain in 1506 and began an active campaign to have her declared incompetent. He told anyone who would listen that his wife was mad, that she had delusions, that she was violent, that she could not be trusted to govern. He produced her emotional outbursts, her refusals to eat, her grief over his infidelities, as clinical evidence of insanity. And crucially, he kept her isolated. No allies, no counsel, no voice. Historians who have examined the court records from this period have found something remarkable. In the documents generated during Juana's life, when Philip and Ferdinand describe her as mad, she is always described in sweeping emotional terms. She is irrational, she is passionate, she is inconsolable, but in the rare moments when Juana herself is recorded speaking, in transcripts of meetings, in surviving letters written in her own hand, a completely different person emerges. She is precise, she is articulate, she is politically astute. When given the opportunity to speak freely, she argues her position with clarity and force. She is not raving. She is not confused. She is a woman who understands exactly what is happening to her and is desperately trying to stop it. In one famous incident in 1506, a group of noblemen attempted to hold an assembly without Juana's consent, essentially governing in her name without her authorization. Juana appeared before them and delivered a speech so clear, so legally grounded, so forceful in its assertion of her royal authority that the assembly was completely silenced. She told them plainly that she was queen, that her authority had not been taken from her, and that they would not act in her name without her permission. The noblemen backed down. The assembly was dissolved. It was not the act of a woman untethered from reality. It was the act of a queen. But then Philip died. September of 1506, just a few weeks after that assembly. He died suddenly, shockingly, at 28 years old, most likely from typhoid fever, though rumors of poison swirled immediately. And this is the moment that history has most cruelly distorted, because what happened next has been packaged for centuries as the ultimate proof of Juana's madness. She refused to allow Philip's body to be buried. She kept it with her. She traveled with his coffin across the Spanish countryside. She reportedly opened the coffin multiple times to look at him. For 500 years, this has been cited as evidence that Juana was unhinged, a grief-mad queen unable to accept the death of her husband. But look at it through a different lens. Philip had been her protector in name, even if he was her captor in practice. His death left her completely exposed. The noblemen around her were already maneuvering. Her father Ferdinand was already returning from his campaigns, already in communication with those same noblemen. She was pregnant. She gave birth to her sixth child just weeks after Philip died. She was isolated, politically vulnerable, and surrounded by men who wanted to use her or remove her. In that context, refusing to finalize the burial was not madness. It was the one tool she had left. As long as Philip was not officially buried, his death was not officially closed. The political transition Ferdinand needed to complete his takeover could not be tidily sealed. She was stalling. She was buying time. It may not have worked, but it was not the act of an irrational woman. It was the act of a desperate one. Ferdinand arrived in 1507. He swept back into Castile under the banner of protecting his poor, grief-stricken, mentally incapable daughter and immediately assumed the regency. Juana was installed in the castle of Tordesillas, a small town in northern Castile, with a staff chosen not to serve her, but to watch her, and there she remained for 46 years. She was 31 years old when the doors of Tordesillas closed around her. She would not emerge as a free woman again in her lifetime. What happened inside those walls is one of history's great silences, deliberately engineered by those who needed Juana to stay silent. The governors appointed to watch over her, first by Ferdinand, later by her son Charles I of Spain, who became the most powerful ruler in the world and had even less interest in seeing his mother freed, controlled all information that came in and went out. Visitors were restricted, letters were intercepted, priests who grew too sympathetic to Juana were replaced. When she complained about her treatment, her complaints were recorded as evidence of her delusions. When she refused to participate in religious observances as a form of protest against her captivity, it was cited as proof of her spiritual disorder. She was trapped in a system where every action she took, every word she spoke, every emotion she expressed, was filtered through the single narrative that had been constructed around her, that she was mad, and that her keepers were doing a kindness by keeping her contained. And yet, visitors who managed to see her, ambassadors, diplomats, the occasional clergyman whose account survives, consistently described someone far more lucid than advertised. A Venetian envoy who met with her in 1525 reported that she spoke with complete coherence, that she expressed a clear understanding of her situation, and that she asked him pointed and intelligent questions about the state of European politics. A papal legate described her as sharp and perceptive. None of these accounts match the raving, delusional figure that official Spanish royal communications continued to describe whenever it was convenient. Charles, her son, visited her only twice in the decades of her imprisonment. He had been raised in Flanders, away from his mother, raised to think of her as tragic and broken. And perhaps he even believed it. On some level, it is easier to govern an empire when the person whose throne you are sitting on has been convincingly labeled unfit. But there is a devastating exchange recorded from his second visit, near the end of Juana's life, when she was in her 70s. She told him that she had been made a prisoner unjustly, that she had never been granted the ability to prove her sanity through proper legal process, and that everything that had been taken from her, her crown, her freedom, her children, her name, had been taken through deception and force. Charles reportedly wept. He promised to look into her situation. He never did. Juana of Castile died in April of 1555 at the age of 75, still inside the walls of Tordesillas. She had been imprisoned for 46 years. She outlived her father, her husband, her mother, and several of her own children. The official royal accounts described her death in terms of relief, the poor mad queen, finally at peace. But the grief that followed among the ordinary people of Castile told a different story. Because despite everything, despite the decades of official narrative, despite the careful management of her image by the most powerful dynasty in the world, ordinary Spaniards had never quite believed it. There had been uprisings during her imprisonment, entire rebellions in fact, fought partly in her name, with rebel leaders demanding that the true queen be released from her unjust captivity. These uprisings were crushed. Their leaders were executed. The inconvenient question they raised was buried with them, but it never fully went away. Modern historians who have gone back to the primary sources, the original court documents, the intercepted letters, the eyewitness accounts, have increasingly concluded that Juana of Castile was not mad in any clinical sense. She may have suffered from what we would today recognize as severe depression, almost certainly triggered and worsened by the genuine trauma of her marriage, her isolation, and her captivity. She may have had episodes of acute psychological crisis, particularly in the early years of her imprisonment. But a woman who suffers from depression is not a woman who cannot rule. A woman who grieves is not a woman who has lost her mind. The label of madness was not a diagnosis. It was a strategy. It worked because it was applied to a woman in a world where women, even queens, had almost no mechanism to defend themselves against it. She could not call witnesses on her own behalf. She could not hire independent legal counsel. She could not appeal to a court that her father or her son did not control. She could not even speak publicly without that speech being filtered through the men who surrounded her and reframed in whatever way served their purposes. The system was designed to make her disappear, and for 5 centuries it largely succeeded, but history has a long memory. And the story of Juana of Castile has refused to stay buried. She has been the subject of operas, novels, paintings, films. She has inspired writers and artists across centuries who sensed, even without access to the archives, that something was not right about the official version. And now, with historians revisiting the documentary evidence through the lens of modern understanding of psychological manipulation, of political captivity, of the ways in which powerful institutions construct and enforce narratives of female incapacity, the picture that emerges is startling in its clarity. Juana of Castile was not the mad queen. She was a queen who was made to look mad by the men who wanted her power. She was a woman who loved too openly in a world that punished women for feeling. She was a ruler whose intelligence and legitimate authority made her dangerous to those who needed her to be nothing more than a figurehead, and when she refused to be nothing, she was taken off the board entirely. The tragedy of Juana is not that she went mad. The tragedy is that she never did. She stayed lucid. She stayed aware. And she spent half a century in a stone room, completely aware of every injustice that had been done to her, unable to do a single thing about it. There is one last detail that history has quietly preserved, a small, devastating fact buried in the records of Tordesillas. In the years of her imprisonment, Juana reportedly kept a window in her room partially open, even in winter. When asked why she endured the cold, she said she was waiting for someone to come, waiting for someone to finally tell the truth. She waited for 46 years. The truth, as it turns out, took a little longer than that. But it came. And her name, her real name, not the epithet that was used to silence her, was Juana, Queen of Castile. And she was never mad. She was simply never free.